I thought no one had ever wanted me, until this house showed me the truth.
She was 19 and unwanted. No family, no address, no room, waiting anywhere, just a canvas bag and $7 she had kept folded beneath her foster care discharge papers. And with $7, the exact sum required by a forgotten family trust, she claimed Blackwood Manor, a condemned brick house outside Harpers Ferry in Jefferson County, West Virginia, erased from county road maps in 1989. Rain entered through the eastern roof. The north chimney had split nearly through. The county had condemned it since 2008 and scheduled it for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that behind the Walnut Library shelves, beneath a sealed staircase unopened for more than 40 years, waited a room whose contents would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Abigail Louise Brooks had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had left the hospital in Martinsburg wrapped in a donated yellow blanket, carried by a county worker whose name did not survive in any record Abigail was later permitted to read. She left her first foster home before she could remember the wallpaper. She left the second with a knitted rabbit whose ears had been repaired in 2 different shades of brown. She left the rabbit beneath a bed in Shepherdstown because the caseworker had packed her belongings before dawn and had not allowed her to go back upstairs. By the age of 9, Abigail understood that departures usually began with adults lowering their voices. A telephone would ring after supper. A bedroom door would close. Someone would use the phrase temporary placement, although nothing in Abigail's life had ever felt temporary. Her possessions would be gathered into grocery sacks, black trash bags, or once, during a wet March, a cardboard box that softened in the rain until its bottom opened beside a county sedan. She learned to own objects that could survive being dropped. A comb with 3 missing teeth, 2 shirts, a library card, a photograph cut from a gardening magazine because the stone house in it had smoke rising from the chimney. She did not know who lived there. She kept it because somebody did. There had been a woman named Elaine Brooks listed on the first page of Abigail's file as her mother. The later pages called Elaine unstable, absent, and unable to provide care. Those words were typed with black certainty, but Abigail remembered her in fragments that did not fit neatly inside them. Elaine smelled of ivory soap and wintergreen mints. She could braid hair tightly enough to last 3 days. She sang the first verse of Shenandoah while washing dishes, though she seldom reached the end. On good mornings, she warmed Abigail's socks over a radiator and slipped them onto her feet before the heat faded. Then there were the other mornings. Curtains remained closed past noon. Letters accumulated beneath the apartment door. Elaine sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup that had gone cold, listening for footsteps in the hallway. When Abigail asked what they were waiting for, her mother would press one finger to her lips. Just let the day pass quietly. Abigail's father had no shape in memory. His name had been removed from one copy of her birth record and left blank on another. Once, when she was 7, she asked Elaine whether he had brown hair. Her mother folded a dish towel into smaller and smaller squares. He had careful hands, she said. That was all. The nearest thing Abigail knew to a father was not a father at all, but her grandmother's older cousin, Margaret Hale, whom everyone in the family had called Aunt Margaret, regardless of the exact branch from which they descended. Margaret lived beyond Bolivar in a narrow white house with green shutters and a garden that had been planted according to usefulness rather than appearance. Rosemary grew beside the steps. Beans climbed locust poles. Calendula crowded the path because Margaret used its petals in salves for chapped skin. She was a bookbinder. Not the decorative sort who covered empty journals for craft fairs, though she had made those too when money was thin. Margaret repaired family Bibles, courthouse ledgers, hymnals, field notebooks, and the hand-sewn account books that had survived barns, floods, estate sales, and careless descendants. Her workroom smelled of wheat paste, leather, linen, thread, and the faint mineral scent of paper stored through many winters. For nearly 4 years before Elaine disappeared and the county closed the remaining path between them, Abigail spent alternate weekends there. Margaret always began Saturday mornings by opening the curtains in the workroom one at a time. She did not switch on the electric lamp unless clouds made it necessary. She said daylight was honest about color. On the scarred oak table, she arranged her tools in a deliberate row. Bone folder, awl, lifting knife, brass-edged ruler, backing hammer, needles wrapped in blue cloth, and a pair of shears that opened with a sound like a slow breath. Abigail was not allowed to touch the knives at first. She carried boards from the press, brushed crumbs of dried paste into her palm, and sorted linen thread by thickness. Margaret showed her how to test paper grain by bending a sheet gently in both directions. One direction resisted, the other yielded. Paper remembers how it was made, Margaret said. At noon, they ate apple slices and sharp cheese beside the work table. Margaret drank tea from a cup with a hairline crack running from rim to handle. Abigail was given milk in a blue enamel tumbler. Neither spoke much while eating. Their silence did not contain punishment. That difference mattered. In the afternoon, they walked to the post office with repaired books wrapped in brown paper and cotton string. Margaret knew which customers could pay and which could not. A widow from Bakerton brought eggs. A retired teacher paid in exact bills kept inside a bank envelope. A quarryman with stone dust embedded in the lines of his hands brought a jar of blackberry preserves and apologized because the lid had rusted. Margaret accepted each offering with the same nod. On Sunday mornings, they cleaned the tools. Steel received a trace of camellia oil. Paste brushes were washed until the water ran clear. Linen scraps were folded rather than thrown away. Even the shortest pieces had uses, Margaret said, though their purpose was not always immediately visible. Before Abigail left, Margaret allowed her to choose one damaged page from the scrap drawer. They mended it together using Japanese tissue so thin it nearly disappeared against the paper. Abigail kept those pages beneath her mattress in every foster house that followed. One carried half a recipe for corn pudding. One held the signature of a justice of the peace from 1912. One was a blank flyleaf stained by the round bottom of a medicine bottle. They were incomplete things made strong enough to continue. Margaret said only one sentence that Abigail remembered word for word. What is torn is not the same as what is lost. At 11, Abigail understood it as an instruction about paper. A tear could be aligned. Fibers could be joined. A missing corner could be supported without pretending it had never been missing. Years later, when she slept in places where no one knew her name, she would understand that Margaret had been speaking about people. The last weekend ended in October. The walnut trees had dropped their husks across the yard, and Margaret's hands were unsteady while she measured a strip of calfskin. Twice she lowered the ruler and waited for the trembling to pass. Abigail noticed a glass bottle of tablets beside the paste pot, though Margaret covered it with a folded rag. They worked on a family Bible whose spine had separated from the text block. Margaret let Abigail sew 3 sections herself. The needle entered each station cleanly. The linen thread tightened without cutting the paper. "That will hold," Margaret said. On Sunday afternoon, she wrapped the Bible, tied the parcel, and placed her brass-edged ruler in Abigail's hands. "Keep this level. Everything else follows." A caseworker arrived before supper. Margaret stood at the gate wearing her brown cardigan despite the cold. Abigail watched through the rear window of the sedan until the White House narrowed between the trees. 3 weeks later, Margaret died in a hospital in Winchester. No one took Abigail to the funeral. A county employee told her during lunch at school, speaking gently while the cafeteria emptied around them. The woman had brought a small paper sack containing Margaret's cardigan and a wooden thimble box. Neither belonged to Margaret. The cardigan smelled of unfamiliar detergent, and the box held 3 plastic buttons. Abigail asked about the workbench, the repaired books, the brass ruler, the blue cloth of needles, and the pages they had mended together. The employee looked down at her form. The estate was handled by family. The family was Richard Hale. He was Elaine's half-brother and Margaret's nearest male relative. According to documents, no one showed Abigail. He wore pressed shirts with collars that stood sharply against his neck. His shoes remained clean even in muddy weather. When he entered a room, he closed the door behind him with care. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke through envelopes, appointments, signatures, and corrections written in the margins of forms. He knew which clerk to call when a record contained an inconvenient name. He knew how long county offices retained carbon copies. He knew that a child moved often enough could become difficult to locate without anyone appearing to hide her. For several months after Margaret's death, he allowed Elaine and Abigail to stay in a duplex he owned near Charlestown. The building stood behind a tire shop where compressors coughed from morning until evening. Their windows faced a cinder block wall streaked with rust. Richard came on the first Monday of every month. He accepted rent from Elaine at the kitchen table and counted it twice. Then he opened a black portfolio and asked questions about her employment, her medication, and whether Abigail had attempted to contact anyone connected to Margaret. Elaine answered with her hands beneath the table. Abigail sat in the adjoining room, close enough to hear the scratch of Richard's pen. Once he asked whether the girl remembered the house near Bolivar. "Children remember pictures," Elaine said, "not places." Richard paused. "Pictures can be corrected." After he left, Elaine burned a bundle of papers in the kitchen sink. She fed them to the flame one sheet at a time and ran water over the ashes before Abigail could read them. Their stay lasted until the morning of November 17th. Abigail was 14. Rain had frozen against the porch railings overnight. Richard arrived at 7 carrying a cardboard file box. 2 men waited beside a white van with the engine running. He placed a typed notice on the kitchen counter. Elaine read it without sitting down. Her lips moved over each line, but no sound came. Richard walked through the rooms placing colored stickers on the furniture. Red on the table, red on the lamp, red on the narrow dresser Elaine had carried from the apartment where Abigail was born. When he reached Abigail's room, she stood between him and the bed. Beneath the mattress were the repaired pages from Margaret's scrap drawer. In the closet, wrapped inside a towel, was the brass-edged ruler Margaret had given her. They were the only objects in the house Abigail understood as inheritance. Richard lifted the mattress with one hand. The pages slid onto the floor. He looked at them without bending. The van leaves in 10 minutes. Take 1 bag. 8 words. Abigail knelt and gathered the pages. One tore beneath her thumb. Richard picked up the ruler from the closet shelf, examined the engraved initials near its edge, and placed it in the file box. "That belongs to the estate." Abigail turned toward her mother. Elaine stood beside the sink wearing the gray coat she used for job interviews. In one hand, she held Abigail's canvas bag. In the other, she held nothing. She had seen the ruler. Her eyes rested on the box, then moved to the ice filmed across the window. She tightened her fingers around the bag strap until her knuckles whitened. She did not speak. That silence followed Abigail longer than any sentence could have. The county placed her in an emergency home in Martinsburg before noon. Elaine was given a different address through a housing program. For a while, postcards arrived without return addresses. Each contained 1 or 2 lines about weather, work, or buses running late. None mentioned Richard. None mentioned Margaret. Then the cards stopped. 5 years later, on the morning Abigail aged out of care, a staff member named Denise set a manila folder on the office desk and explained the transition resources available to her. There was a shelter bed in Winchester, perhaps, though intake would not open until evening. There was a workforce number she could call. There was a voucher for 2 bus rides. Her Medicaid coverage would continue temporarily. The state provided a check, but an administrative hold had delayed it. Denise spoke with the practiced kindness of someone carrying too many names. Abigail signed 3 forms. Her belongings filled the same canvas bag Elaine had held on the morning of the eviction. The seams had been repaired with black thread. Inside were 2 changes of clothing, the library photograph of the stone house, Margaret's damaged pages, and a pair of work gloves taken from a donation bin. In her coat pocket were $12.43. 6 weeks later, only $7 remained. During the first week, she slept at the Winchester shelter beside a woman named Alma, who removed her shoes each night and placed them beneath her pillow so they would not be taken. Abigail spent mornings at the Handley Library and afternoons filling applications at grocery stores, laundries, motels, and a poultry plant south of town. She learned that applications required addresses. Shelters were not always accepted. Public benches were never accepted. The blank line seemed modest on paper, but it could close like a locked door. When the shelter's 14-night limit ended, she rode a bus to Martinsburg and slept behind a church fellowship hall where warm air escaped through a basement vent. The concrete held the day's heat for nearly an hour after sunset. At 3 a.m, sprinklers came on and soaked the sleeve beneath her head. She spent $1.25 at a laundromat, feeding quarters into a dryer while wearing her spare shirt beneath her coat. A woman folding children's pajamas gave her a dryer sheet and half a roll of quarters. "Machines steal time," the woman said. "Do not let them steal warmth, too." Abigail remembered her because she did not ask for an explanation. The next 10 nights were divided among places chosen for their light, shelter, and distance from locked gates. A loading dock behind a furniture warehouse, the rear stairwell of a parking garage, a picnic pavilion beside Oatsdale Park, where wind pushed dead leaves across the concrete until they gathered around her shoes. She rode to Hagerstown using the second bus voucher and spent $3 on soup, bread, and a cup of coffee at a diner near South Potomac Street. The waitress, whose name tag read Doris, refilled the cup 4 times and placed 2 wrapped biscuits beside the check. These were counted wrong, Doris said. They had not been. Abigail carried them into the bus station and ate one that night. She saved the other until morning, though hunger kept waking her. By the 5th week, she had learned which public buildings opened earliest. She washed at library sinks with folded paper towels. She mended a split cuff using thread pulled from the lining of her bag. She kept her discharge papers inside a plastic bread sleeve because identification was more valuable than clothing. The money diminished carefully. 99 cents for canned beans, 50 cents for a bruised apple at closing time, $1 for a church thrift store scarf, 75 cents to photocopy documents, $2 to ride a county bus after sleet began falling sideways. She accounted for every coin in the margin of a workforce pamphlet. On a Thursday morning in early December, she entered the Washington County Free Library with $7 even in her pocket and melting ice along the shoulders of her coat. The building had just opened. Heat rose from the floor vents with the smell of dust and wet wool. Abigail took her usual seat near the local newspapers where the windows faced South Potomac Street, and no librarian objected if she remained for several hours. She began with employment listings: housekeeping, dishwashing, seasonal warehouse labor, home health aid certification required, driver's license required, reliable transportation required. Near the bottom of the classifieds, beneath an advertisement for 2 cemetery plots, and above a notice concerning unclaimed farm machinery, a narrow, boxed announcement had been printed in type so compact that she nearly passed over it. Jefferson County abandoned property disposition. Blackwood Manor and attached acreage. Structure unsafe. No utilities. Title transfer subject to existing trust conditions. Qualified claimant fee, $7. Inquiries in person only. The word claimant stopped her. Not buyer, not bidder. Claimant. Below the notice was a reference number and an address for the county clerk's office in Charlestown. The filing date was nearly 30 days earlier. The final day for inquiry was Monday. Abigail copied the advertisement onto the back of her workforce pamphlet, preserving every comma. Then she carried the newspaper to the reference desk and asked whether older county property maps were available. The librarian showed her a cabinet of microfilm and helped thread a reel through the machine. Blackwood Manor appeared in tax notices, foreclosure lists, and once in a 1976 article about endangered buildings along the Shenandoah Valley. The photograph was grainy. A 3-story brick house stood behind walnut trees, its windows reflecting white sky. Beneath the image, one sentence mentioned its last private owner, Margaret Whittaker Hale. Abigail read the name twice. The middle name belonged to a branch she had never heard spoken. The final name was Richards. The first belonged to the woman who had taught her that torn things were not always lost. She printed the page. The machine charged 25 cents. At noon, she took the elevator to the ground floor and stood inside the library vestibule, where the outer doors opened each time someone approached. Cold air moved around her ankles. Buses to Charlestown required money she did not have, and walking the full distance would take more than a day. Abigail called the number printed beneath the county notice from the library's public telephone. A man answered on the 4th ring. "Your name," he said. "Please tell me your full name." Abigail Louise Brooks. The line went silent. "Do not leave the library," he said. "I have been looking for you for 11 years. 40 minutes later, an elderly attorney arrived carrying a weather-stained file marked Brooks. Abigail. His name was Thomas Whittaker. He did not ask her to trust him. He opened the file on a reading table and placed 3 documents beneath the green library lamp. The first was Margaret's trust instrument. The second was Elaine Brooks's birth certificate. The third was an adoption petition that had been prepared but never finalized. "The $7 is not the purchase price," Thomas said. "It opens a 72-hour claim period. You must prove your identity, accept the unpaid obligations, survive any objection, and persuade the county to suspend demolition." Abigail stared at Elaine's birth certificate. "My mother was Margaret's niece." Thomas turned the document toward her. Margaret Whittaker's name appeared on the line marked Mother. Your mother was her daughter. Traffic moved behind them. A bus sighted at the curb and opened its doors. Somewhere inside the bakery building, an old pipe knocked twice. Abigail looked at Thomas's ink-stained thumb, the untouched breakfast, and the careful way he held the paper flat against the wind. She removed the coins from her pocket. 64 cents lay in her palm. "I spent most of it. I know. I do not have $7 now." Thomas folded the notice along its original crease. Then he lifted the egg sandwich, divided it with the paper wrapper, and gave half back to her. "The filing window closes Monday," he said. "The law does not require the same $7. Abigail did not eat immediately. For 6 weeks, she had protected those bills as though they were the final proof that she still possessed choices. Now the money was gone, transformed into warm coffee beneath a bakery awning, and a stranger with her grandmother's family name was telling her that an abandoned house had been waiting behind the silence of every adult who had failed to speak. Thomas said he could drive her as far as Shepherdstown that afternoon. From there, he needed to collect files from his office before meeting her at the county building on Monday morning. He gave her the address of a church hall that opened during severe weather and wrote his telephone number beneath it. Abigail read each digit before folding the paper. She did not agree because she believed him. She agreed because Margaret had once told her daylight was honest about color, and Thomas had offered to meet her in a public office before clerks, records, stamps, and locked cabinets. Whatever waited there would have names and dates. Those could be tested. She ate her half of the sandwich beneath the awning while sleet settled over the street. Thomas finished the other half without haste. When they rose, he carried the empty cups to a bin and returned the wrapper to his pocket so it would not blow away. By late afternoon, Abigail was walking south from Shepherdstown with the canvas bag against her hip, the county notice inside her coat, and Margaret's incomplete pages protected beneath the bread sleeve. Ahead of her, beyond the river roads and winter fields, a condemned house waited with rain entering through its roof. Behind one of its walls, the past had kept every letter she had never received. The road narrowed after the last row of houses and began its slow descent toward the Potomac. Abigail walked until the afternoon light turned the winter fields the color of pewter. The canvas bag rubbed a raw place against her hip, so she shifted it from one shoulder to the other every half-mile, measuring distance by fence posts, drainage culverts, and the green mile markers that appeared less often than she needed them. The sleet had stopped, but the air remained wet and exact. Cold entered through the stitched seam of her right glove and settled first in the tips of 2 fingers. She tucked that hand beneath her opposite arm whenever no vehicle was approaching. Thomas had offered directions to the church shelter and money for transportation. She had accepted the directions and refused the money. It was not pride in the way people often misunderstood pride. She had spent years receiving what other people had decided she required, then watching those gifts become evidence against her. A bed could become a debt. A meal could become a reason to obey. A coat could be recalled when gratitude failed to look convincing enough. She needed the next miles to belong to her. Near dusk, a farmer in a faded red pickup slowed beside the shoulder. A collie stood with its paws against the passenger window, breathing a white circle onto the glass. The farmer leaned across the seat. "You headed into town. South. That is not a town. It is the direction." He studied the low clouds and the thinness of her coat. "There's a hay barn 2 miles down, past the stone culvert. Belongs to the Millers. They will not mind if you keep clear of the equipment." Abigail thanked him. The truck moved on, carrying the dog's pale face away through the rear window. She found the barn after dark. Its broad doors had been fastened with a chain, but a side opening stood wide enough for a person to enter. Inside, stacked hay held the summer scent of cut grass beneath the dust and cold. Rusted implements rested along one wall. A green tractor occupied the center aisle, its rear tire taller than Abigail's shoulder. She chose a place behind the hay bales where the wind could not reach directly. Mice moved within the walls with a soft, dry persistence. Somewhere above, a pigeon adjusted itself on a rafter. The temperature fell to 26 degrees before midnight. She knew because an enamel thermometer hung beside the tack room, its red line visible whenever moonlight passed through a crack in the boards. Abigail spread her coat beneath her rather than over her. Margaret had once taught her that the ground carried away more warmth than the air. She placed the canvas bag beneath her knees, wrapped the thrift store scarf around her head, and drew handfuls of loose hay around her shoes. Sleep came in narrow intervals. During one waking, she heard water ticking from the eaves. During another, the tractor metal made a low, contracting sound. Near dawn, she smelled coffee before she saw anyone. A woman stood at the end of the aisle, holding a thermos and a paper sack. She was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with gray hair braided beneath a knitted cap. "My husband saw the side door open," she said. "He said either a fox got clever or somebody needed shelter." Abigail sat up. "I did not touch anything. I can see that." The woman poured coffee into the thermos lid and set it on the floor between them. Steam lifted into the barn's blue morning air. "There is bread in the sack, ham too. I cannot pay." It was not priced. Abigail accepted the cup with both hands. The woman did not ask for her history. She pointed toward a frost-free hydrant behind the barn and said the water was clean. Before leaving, she placed 2 pairs of wool socks on the hay bale. "My sons outgrew them." Both pairs were plainly adult-sized. Abigail waited until the woman had crossed the yard before changing her socks. The dry wool reached halfway to her knees. By 8, she was walking again. The journey from the barn to Charlestown covered 11 miles by the road she followed. Thomas had marked a shorter route on the paper, but a bridge crew had closed one lane, and the shoulder disappeared near a limestone cut. Abigail took the longer road through Kearneysville, where freight tracks divided a cluster of houses from low warehouses and bare orchards. She rested behind a feed store and ate half the bread. At noon, a church thermometer read 34 degrees. Wind moved from the west with the smell of wood smoke and frozen earth. Her legs had begun to tremble whenever she stopped, so she stopped less often. By the time the courthouse clock came into view, daylight was thinning behind the roofs. Charles Town did not announce itself grandly. It gathered around her by degrees, brick sidewalks, clipped hedges, narrow streets, and buildings whose upper windows carried curtains from another century. A traffic light changed above an intersection where only 3 cars waited. On Washington Street, a bakery displayed braided loaves beneath glass domes. Beside it stood a pharmacy with gold lettering painted directly on the window. Farther down was a barber shop marked by a striped pole that no longer turned, a feed and seed store with sacks stacked behind the door, and a cafe whose front window had clouded from cooking. The 5th business was a hardware store. Its sign read Bell and Son Hardware, though the smaller lettering beneath showed that no son had worked there since 1968. Snow shovels leaned outside beside galvanized buckets. In the window, a hand-painted card advertised stove rope, chimney brushes, lamp oil, glazing points, and kerosene wicks. Abigail stopped long enough to read every line. She did not yet know why the list felt important. The county offices occupied a brick building 1 block from the courthouse. Stone steps led to a portico supported by square columns. A brass plaque beside the door listed the departments inside, including records, assessment, planning, and deeds. The outer doors had been locked. Abigail checked the courthouse clock. 5 minutes past 5. She stood beneath the portico with the notice in her hand. The glass reflected her coat, damp at the shoulders, and the canvas bag resting near her boots. Behind the doors, ceiling lights remained on above a tiled hallway. A custodian pushing a yellow mop bucket saw her. He pointed toward a second entrance around the side. Abigail lifted the notice against the glass. The custodian adjusted his glasses, read the county seal, and disappeared down the corridor. A minute later, a woman opened the door 6 inches. "We are closed, I know. Then you know to return tomorrow. The notice says inquiries must be made in person by Monday. Today is Friday. I have been walking." The woman looked beyond Abigail toward the street, perhaps expecting a parent, an attorney, or a vehicle with its hazard lights on. "Which property?" Abigail handed the notice through the gap. The woman read the reference number. Her posture changed so slightly that another person might have missed it. She opened the door wider. "Come in before the heat leaves." The county clerk's office had high ceilings and a floor of black and white tile worn pale along the central path. Metal shelving held deed books bound in red, green, and brown. A clock above the public counter clicked loudly between minutes. The woman locked the door again, then led Abigail beneath a sign reading Recording Division. Her nameplate said Eleanor Voss. She wore a navy cardigan fastened at the throat with a silver bar pin. Her hair was cut level with her jaw and had been brushed back from a face whose lines seemed formed less by age than by years of reading poor handwriting. A pencil rested behind her left ear. "Sit." Abigail took the wooden chair opposite the counter. Mrs. Voss placed the notice flat beneath a desk lamp. She opened a ledger, compared the reference number, and then examined Abigail's discharge identification with a magnifying glass she removed from a drawer. "Who told you about this?" "I found the advertisement. That is not what I asked. An attorney said he filed it." "Name?" Abigail gave it. The clerk's eyes lifted. "He was supposed to be here this morning. He said Monday." "He said that to you?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Voss closed the ledger. "He called twice today." Abigail waited. The clerk removed the pencil from behind her ear and placed it precisely beside the notice. "You understand the structure has no electric service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been certified potable since 2007? "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the eastern roof has failed over 2 rooms, and the county will not insure your occupancy. Yes, ma'am. You understand property taxes remain due even when the property produces no income. Yes, ma'am. You understand that accepting title also means accepting every broken pipe, unstable stair, lien inspection, and boundary dispute attached to the land. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Voss leaned back. Most people interrupt before the fourth warning. I do not have a better property. You do not presently have this one. No, ma'am. The answer seemed to satisfy something that a more confident reply would not have satisfied. Mrs. Voss opened a gray folder secured with cotton tape. Inside were copies of surveys, tax maps, photographs, inspection reports, and a deed typed on cream paper with a red margin line. The first page carried Margaret's signature. Abigail recognized the formation before she read the name. The capital M began with a narrow upward stroke. The final T crossed leftward, against the usual direction, because Margaret had injured her wrist as a young woman and found that motion easier. The clerk watched Abigail's hand settle on the counter. You recognize it? Yes. Mrs. Voss did not ask how. She brought out a second document. This is the trust condition. The claimant must establish identity through the attached lineage affidavit, accept the property without warranty, and tender $7 in lawful currency. The amount is nominal. Its purpose is contractual. I spent it. I am aware. Abigail looked toward the clock. Mrs. Voss opened another drawer and removed a plain white envelope. Mr. Whittaker left this at noon. Inside were 7 $1 bills. They were not new. One had a blue ink mark near the portrait. Another had been repaired with transparent tape along its upper edge. Thomas had written a single line on the envelope. A debt, not a gift, repayable when the roof does not leak. Abigail counted the bills twice. The clerk turned the deed toward her and placed a fountain pen beside the signature line. Read before signing. It took 43 minutes. The legal language moved through easements, mineral rights, drainage, inheritance contingencies, and a narrow access strip along the northern boundary. Abigail read every sentence. When she reached a word she did not understand, Mrs. Voss defined it without impatience. The property consisted of 11 acres, not merely the manor and its yard. A stone spring house stood near the western boundary. An abandoned carriage barn was listed as collapsed. The county held a demolition order, but transfer to a qualified claimant would suspend that order for 180 days. Abigail traced the survey line with one finger. What happens after that? An inspector returns, and if the house is not safe, the order resumes. How safe? Mrs. Voss took a printed checklist from another folder. Dry roof, stable chimney, secured openings, one habitable room, sanitary waste arrangement, safe access. Electricity? Not for the first inspection. Running water? Not if the well is capped and you provide an approved temporary source. Abigail folded the checklist along its center. The task was larger than anything she had done. That did not make it abstract. It had rafters, mortar, glass, hinges, and deadlines. Objects could be learned. She signed. Mrs. Voss counted the 7 bills into the county receipt drawer and pressed a lever on an aged brass stamp. The mechanism descended with a heavy final sound. Purple ink marked the transfer date across the deed. A second stamp entered the recording number. A third embossed the county seal. The clerk slid the certified copy across the counter. Take care of that. Abigail placed it inside the plastic sleeve with her identification. Mrs. Voss gave her a ring carrying 2 iron keys and 1 smaller brass key, darkened nearly brown. A paper tag had been tied to the ring with cotton thread. Front, side, library. The front lock may not turn, the clerk said. The side door was used during the last inspection. Which way? Mrs. Voss took a local road map from a wall rack and marked the route. South on George Street, east toward Summit Point Road. Then a lesser road passing orchards, a Quaker cemetery, and a one-room schoolhouse converted into a residence. After the pavement narrows, look for a stone wall on your left. The entrance is half a mile beyond it. 2 brick pillars, one is down. How far? 7 3/4 miles. Abigail had walked farther that day. Mrs. Voss gathered the remaining papers but left the trust affidavit on the desk. Her fingertip rested beside the claimant's surname. I knew Margaret. The office clock clicked once. She recorded repairs here for half the county. Deeds, Bibles, tax books, marriage registers. She could remove mold from paper without lifting the ink. Abigail looked toward the shelves of bound volumes. Did she work on those? Many. Mrs. Voss stood and crossed to a case near the rear wall. She unlocked it with a key kept on a chain beneath her cardigan and removed a ledger wrapped in gray cloth. The binding had been restored in brown calfskin. The corners were strengthened with material slightly darker than the boards. Along the spine, 5 raised bands stood evenly spaced. Mrs. Voss opened the book near its center. Inside the front cover, written in pencil no darker than breath, were the initials M.W.H. and a date from 28 years earlier. She refused payment for this one, the clerk said. The county budget had been frozen. She said records belonged to those not yet born. Abigail touched no part of the ledger. Mrs. Voss closed it. When the trust notice came across my counter, I wondered whether the claimant would carry her name. I do not. Not that name. The clerk returned the ledger to the case. Brooks was the surname of Margaret's mother before marriage. The line goes back through the house. It appears in 3 deed books and a probate volume. Abigail remembered the classified notice, the attorney's still face beneath the awning, and the empty place on her birth record. Why did no one tell me? Mrs. Voss locked the case. I can certify records. I cannot certify motives. It was the most honest answer Abigail had received. The clerk put on her coat and switched off the public counter lights. In the dimmer room, the deed shelves became dark columns running toward the ceiling. You should not walk there tonight, she said. I need to see it. You need daylight. I have been told what I needed for most of my life. Mrs. Voss buttoned her coat. That sounds like something Margaret would have answered. She carried Abigail's bag without asking, and led her through a rear corridor into an employee parking lot. An aging station wagon waited beneath a sycamore tree, its roof patched with gray primer. The clerk opened the passenger door. I can take you as far as the cemetery. My sister lives nearby. Abigail accepted. They drove through town without conversation. Storefronts passed in lit rectangles, the bakery closing its blinds, the pharmacy displaying a red neon mortar and pestle, the cafe where a cook scraped the griddle clean, the barber shop dark except for a lamp over one chair, and Bell and Son Hardware with its buckets pulled indoors. At the edge of town, houses gave way to fields. Mrs. Voss kept both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. She drove below the speed limit, slowing for every curve. The heater blew strongly against Abigail's boots and carried the faint smell of dust. They passed a cattle farm, a volunteer fire station, and an orchard where bare apple trees stood in measured rows. At the Quaker cemetery, the clerk turned into a gravel lane and stopped beside a stone wall. My sister's house is through there. A porch light shone beyond a stand of cedar. Mrs. Voss removed a flashlight from beneath the seat. Return it when you record the occupancy inspection. Abigail took it. That may not be soon. The batteries are new. The station wagon reversed carefully and disappeared toward the main road. Abigail continued alone. Night had settled fully. The temperature had fallen below freezing again, and shallow puddles along the shoulder carried skins of ice. Her legs were stiff from sitting in the heated car. Each step loosened them with a dull ache. The flashlight beam found the road edge, mailbox posts, and weeds bent beneath frost. A dog barked from a farmhouse to her right. It came running along the inside of a wire fence, large and black, its body appearing and disappearing between the posts. Abigail kept walking without looking directly at it. After 50 yards, the barking changed from warning to complaint. A porch door opened. "Belle, leave it." The dog stopped. An older man stood beneath the porch light wearing suspenders over a flannel shirt. "You looking for the Hale place?" Abigail halted. "The manor." "Same place." He came as far as the fence. A white beard covered most of his face. One suspender had been repaired with a piece of leather. "Road bends left after the walnut stand. Gate is another quarter-mile." "Thank you." "You family?" Abigail shifted the bag strap. "I have the deed." The man looked at the flashlight, the coat, and the absence of a vehicle behind her. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Belle will bark again when you pass the far fence," he said. "She does not mean anything by it." The dog sat beside him. Abigail continued. Walnut trees appeared along both sides of the road, their branches black against the sky. Fallen husks cracked under her boots. The smell was dark and bitter where tires had crushed them into the gravel. The road dipped, crossed a narrow culvert, and bent left. At first, she saw only the pillars. One stood upright, capped with a flat slab of limestone. The other had collapsed outward, scattering bricks into the weeds. Between them hung the remains of an iron gate, one side twisted low enough to touch the ground. A wooden board had been nailed across the standing pillar. "Danger. Unsafe structure. County. Order 08-114. Abigail stepped over the fallen gate. The drive extended through a tunnel of trees. Gravel had vanished beneath moss and leaves, though 2 shallow wheel tracks remained visible. Brambles caught at her coat. Once, the flashlight passed over the pale eyes of a deer standing among the trunks. Then the house entered the beam. Blackwood Manor was larger than the newspaper photograph had suggested, and less graceful than memory would have permitted. It stood 3 stories high, 70 feet across the front, built of dark red brick laid in Flemish bond. Pale mortar joints crossed the walls in thin, weathered lines. The central section rose beneath a hipped slate roof, with 2 lower wings extending north and south. Nearly a third of the eastern roof had collapsed inward. Rafters projected through the opening like the ribs of a stranded vessel. Several courses of brick had fallen from the north chimney, leaving a jagged split wide enough to admit moonlight. 6 columns supported the front portico. 2 had shed their outer plaster, exposing brick cores beneath. The stone steps had settled unevenly. 1 iron handrail leaned away from the masonry. There were 22 visible windows. 9 had glass. Boards covered 5. The rest reflected the flashlight in broken triangles. Vines had entered the upper frames and spread along interior ceilings. A dormer on the south wing had tilted several inches from square. The house was not merely neglected. It had been left in the middle of failing. To the right of the portico, an oval plaque remained fastened to the brick. Dirt and lichen covered its lettering. Abigail wiped the surface with her sleeve. Blackwood Manor. Built 1788, restored 1911. Beneath those dates, someone had scratched a third line by hand. Kept. The word was shallow and nearly lost under weather. Abigail tried the front key. It entered the lock but would not turn. She pressed her shoulder against the door and felt no movement. The wood had swollen inside the frame. She followed the wall toward the southern wing. The side entrance stood beneath a copper awning green with age. One hinge had loosened, leaving the door at a slight angle. The second iron key turned halfway, resisted, then completed its motion with a sound from deep inside the mechanism. Abigail pulled. The lower edge dragged across the stone floor. Air came outward. It smelled of damp plaster, mouse nests, extinguished fireplaces, and wood that had absorbed 40 seasons of weather. Beneath those odors rested something fainter: leather, paste, and paper. She raised the flashlight. The beam crossed a narrow hall paneled in walnut. Water stains descended from the ceiling in overlapping brown circles. A runner lay along the floor, its central pattern worn away. Framed photographs had been removed from the walls, leaving rectangles of cleaner wallpaper. The first room opened to her left. It had once been a parlor. A marble mantel leaned slightly from the wall. Horsehair protruded from the torn underside of a sofa. Leaves had blown through a broken window and gathered against a piano whose keys were yellow beneath dust. Abigail pressed one key. No sound came. The second room contained a long dining table, 12 chairs, and a sideboard with all its drawers pulled open. Plaster had fallen across one end of the table. A raccoon had left prints in the dust, each narrow hand clearly marked. Somewhere above, water dropped at a patient interval. Abigail closed the side door and tested it from inside. The lock held. She tied a length of frayed curtain cord between the handle and a wall bracket, then placed a chair beneath it. The flashlight beam weakened whenever she angled it toward the ceiling. She moved through the central hall slowly, testing each board before committing her weight. The house answered with creaks from places she had not touched. Wind entered through the broken eastern wing and traveled behind the walls, producing a low note near the staircase. The front room on the western side had suffered less damage. Its windows were intact beneath exterior shutters. The ceiling showed no active leak. Built-in shelves covered one wall from floor to crown molding, all made of dark walnut polished by hands long gone. Most shelves stood empty. A few books remained swollen against one another, their titles obscured by mildew. The fireplace contained bird nests and a mass of fallen mortar. She would not light it. Beyond the shelves, a narrow door led to a back room that had once served as an office or sewing chamber. A cast-iron stove stood on a slate hearth. Its pipe had been disconnected and capped with cloth. One wall held shallow drawers labeled in faded ink. Thread, cloth, receipts, letters, bills, all were empty. A cot frame rested upright behind the door. Its canvas had rotted through, but the iron legs were sound. Abigail lowered it, stretched her coat across the frame, and placed the canvas bag beneath her head. Before lying down, she searched the room completely. The closet contained a broom without bristles, 2 glass lamp chimneys, and a chipped wash basin. Beneath the window stood a cedar chest, unlocked and bare, except for a folded newspaper dated March 1962. A mouse had eaten half the front page. The brass key marked library did not fit any visible lock. She kept it in her pocket. Hunger arrived when she stopped moving. Abigail ate the remaining bread from the barn and drank water from the bottle she had filled at the hydrant. The ham she saved for morning. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches. The upper limbs scraped one another with a hollow wooden sound. From deeper in the house came the drop of water, the settling of plaster, and once, a brief rush of wings in the chimney. Abigail removed her wet socks and laid them across the back of a chair. The borrowed wool pair remained dry beneath them. She spread Margaret's repaired pages on the table. The recipe fragment, the courthouse signature, the blank leaf with the medicine ring stain. She weighted their corners with pieces of fallen plaster so the draft would not lift them. Then she placed the certified deed beside them. For the first time, her name appeared on a document that did not describe her as a ward, a placement, a dependent, a case, or a person discharged from care. Owner. The word was printed once beneath the property description. Abigail touched it with one finger. The room had no heat. The roof required work she did not yet know how to perform. The county would return in 6 months, and the money in her possession had been reduced to coins. She had no food beyond one portion of ham, no tools beyond work gloves, and no proof that the well water would not make her ill. Yet no one could move her belongings before dawn. No caseworker possessed a key, No landlord could enter with colored stickers. She switched off the flashlight to conserve the batteries. Darkness gathered without becoming complete. Moonlight entered through the shutter slats and crossed the floor in narrow bands. It reached the lower shelves, the sealed drawers, and the door, whose small brass key remained warm in her pocket. Abigail lay awake for a long time, listening to the house make room for her breathing. The house was patient. So was she. At first light, Abigail carried the wash basin outside and followed the slope behind the southern wing until she found the well. It stood beneath a roof of hand-split shingles, 20 paces beyond the kitchen door. One cedar post had rotted at ground level, leaving the small structure tilted toward the house. A galvanized bucket rested upside down beside the stone curb, its bottom perforated by rust. Abigail removed the inspection tag from the well cap and read it twice. Untested. Do not drink. She lifted the cap only far enough to shine Mrs. Voss's flashlight inside. The stone shaft narrowed into darkness. Far below, water reflected a coin-sized circle of light and trembled when wind moved across the opening. She lowered the cap carefully. The temporary sanitation arrangement listed in the county folder was less mysterious. An outhouse stood beyond the lilacs, hidden beneath honeysuckle and a leaning apple tree. Its door had fallen inward, but the pit remained covered, and the framing had not collapsed. Abigail righted the door, drove 2 loose hinge pins back into place with a stone, and wedged the threshold level using a fragment of slate. Nothing about the task was pleasant. It was, however, possible. For drinking water, she walked each morning to the farmhouse where the black dog lived. The man with the repaired suspender introduced himself as Walter Bell and the dog as Bell. He filled 2 glass cider jugs from his kitchen tap and refused to accept the coins Abigail offered. The line runs whether I fill these or not. On the second morning, he gave her a length of clothesline. On the third, he handed her a dented enamel pot and said it had been waiting in his shed since his wife replaced it 15 years earlier. Bell accompanied Abigail as far as the property gate, then sat beside the fallen pillar and watched her carry the jugs up the drive. The first 3 days were devoted to learning where danger ended and inconvenience began. Abigail marked unsafe floorboards with chalk taken from a school slate in the dining room cabinet. She tested the staircase using the broom handle, pressing each tread before placing her foot on it. The 4th step creaked beneath weight but remained firm. The 7th dipped near the wall. The landing gave a short complaint whenever the temperature changed. The eastern corridor was closed entirely. She stretched the clothesline across its entrance and tied strips of torn curtain fabric at eye level. Beyond it, rain had softened ceiling plaster until sections hung like pale cloth. A bedroom floor had collapsed into the room below, carrying a brass bed frame halfway through the joists. She did not enter. The west wing offered 6 dry rooms, though only one could presently be closed against wind. Abigail selected the back office as her sleeping place and the library as her work area. She swept both from ceiling to floor, beginning with cobwebs and ending with the gaps between boards. Dust rose in such quantity that she tied a damp strip of linen across her nose. The first pass uncovered nails, beetle shells, fragments of glass, 2 buttons, a child's marble, and a silver-plated teaspoon blackened nearly blue. She placed each useful object in a shallow drawer and carried the refuse outside in a coal scuttle. By evening, she could distinguish the house's common sounds. The slow wooden knock near the dining room came from a shutter moving against brick. The whisper inside the north wall was dry leaves trapped behind loosened siding. The repeated tap above the library was water dropping into a metal basin left by a previous inspector. Other sounds remained unexplained. Near midnight, something small crossed the ceiling above her cot. At dawn, 3 dull knocks came from within the library shelving, spaced too evenly to resemble an animal. Abigail searched for loose boards and found none. She wrote the sound in the margin of the inspection checklist. Library west wall. 3 knocks. Morning. Margaret had taught her that uncertainty improved when given a name and location. On the fourth day, Abigail walked into Charlestown carrying a list. She needed a chimney brush, rope, lamp oil, matches, a dust mask, nails, a hammer, food, soap, and some means of heating water. She possessed 64 cents, Thomas's note, and a deed whose practical value depended upon work she could not afford. The front bell of Bell & Son Hardware produced a flat metallic ring when she entered. Warm air smelled of pine boards, machine oil, fertilizer, and coffee left too long on a burner. Narrow aisles ran between shelving units built from mismatched lumber. Every wall held merchandise: handsaws, stovepipe elbows, coils of rope, glass jars of screws, paintbrushes suspended by their handles, axe heads, garden hose, copper fittings, and cardboard boxes faded by years of window light. A pot-bellied stove stood near the counter. Beside it sat Walter Bell. Without his coat, he appeared narrower than Abigail remembered. His white beard reached the second button of his shirt. A leather apron covered his trousers, and a folding rule protruded from one pocket. He looked at the list in her hand. "You found the store. I did not know it was yours." Most people suspect it from the sign. There was no son behind the counter. Walter explained that the name had belonged first to his father and then to himself. His own son had moved to Ohio, where he repaired hospital elevators and had no interest in kerosene wicks. Abigail placed her coins on the counter. "I need to make the chimney usable." Walter did not touch the money. "Which chimney?" "The library fireplace shares the south stack." "It did once." "The flue may be blocked." "It is." "You have been inside?" "County asked me to board windows after vandals went through in '97. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with the hem of his apron. There were jackdaw nests from the smoke shelf to the second-floor bend. Mortar had fallen behind the damper. Might be squirrels now. "I need a brush." "You need 3 brushes, 2 rods, a mirror, goggles, gloves, a scraper, and enough sense not to stand beneath what you loosen." "I have gloves." "I have seen those gloves." He put his glasses back on. "They are for moving boxes." Walter walked the aisles with Abigail's list. He selected items without placing them on the counter: a 6-inch round wire brush, 4 flexible fiberglass rods, a flat steel scraper, braided sash cord, 2 cotton dust masks, safety glasses with scratched lenses, a box of kitchen matches, a quart of lamp oil, and a pair of leather gauntlets darkened from previous use. Abigail followed him. "I cannot buy those." "I know. I am not taking them." "I know that, too." At the rear counter, Walter opened a ledger whose cloth cover had been repaired with brown leather along the spine. He wrote her name at the top of a blank page. Then he wrote, "Blackwood account." "No." "The county gives you 6 months. I may not be able to pay. Then I will know where you live. I do not know when I can pay." "Neither do I." Walter dipped the pen again. "Accounts are not promises about dates. They are records of what passed from one hand to another." Abigail looked at the repaired binding. "Did Margaret fix that?" "She fixed every ledger my father ruined." He turned the book so she could see the pencil initials inside the cover. "M.W.H. She would not approve of you giving away supplies. I am not giving anything away." Walter wrote the first price. "Chimney brush, $4.79. He continued down the page. 4 extension rods, $6.40. Steel scraper, $1.15. Used goggles, no charge. Cotton masks, 28 cents each. Lamp oil, 89 cents. Matches, 12 cents. Braided cord, 36 cents. Leather gloves, used, 50 cents. When he finished, the account totaled $14.77. Abigail read every figure. "What interest? None. Late fee? None. What do you want?" Walter closed the ledger. The place not to fall. From beneath the counter, he removed a thick paperback manual with a yellow cover. Home Repair for the Practical Owner. The corners had rounded from handling. Water stains marked the lower pages, and several chapters contained notes written in pencil. This belongs to the lending shelf. There is no lending shelf. There is now. Abigail opened to the chimney chapter. A diagram showed the smoke chamber, damper, shelf, flue liner, crown, and cap. How long can I keep it? Until you no longer need to ask. Walter added dried beans, oatmeal, salt, a bar of lye soap, and 6 candles to the account. Abigail objected until he pointed to the margin of Margaret's repaired ledger. A notation had been written there years earlier in a hand Abigail recognized. Necessary materials may be paid in work when money fails. What work? Inventory. The hardware store contained hundreds of bins whose handwritten labels no longer matched their contents. Walter needed someone to sort hinges by size, separate machine screws from wood screws, and count glazing points into paper packets. One afternoon each week, he said, we will call the food wages and the tools credit. Abigail looked toward the stove, the crowded shelves, and the repaired account book. That is exact? That is honest. She agreed. Walter gave her the supplies in 2 cloth feed sacks and drew a chimney cross-section on the back of an invoice. Before she left, he added a narrow inspection mirror attached to a telescoping handle. Do not light a fire because the brush comes back clean. What else? Check the mortar joints, check the smoke shelf, check the crown from outside. I cannot reach the crown. Then do not pretend you did. He returned to the stove. Fire punishes guessing. The walk back took longer under the weight of the sacks. Abigail reached Blackwood before sunset and began with the fireplace opening. She laid old newspapers across the library floor, extending them 8 feet from the hearth. Over the papers, she placed damp sheets found in an upstairs linen cupboard. The cloth would catch dust that escaped the firebox. She removed the cast-iron grate. Behind it, soot had accumulated in ridges. 2 bird skeletons rested near the rear wall, their bones tangled with grass and string. Abigail lifted them with the coal shovel and buried them beneath the walnut trees. The damper plate had rusted nearly shut. She brushed its hinges with lamp oil, waited 20 minutes, and worked the lever in movements no greater than an inch. Rust fell in orange flakes. After 11 attempts, the plate opened far enough to reveal the smoke shelf. The inspection mirror showed darkness packed with nesting material. Abigail tied the dust mask behind her head, put on the goggles, and inserted the steel scraper above the damper. Dry grass descended first, then feathers, then walnut shells carried there by squirrels. A length of blue yarn appeared, followed by 2 pages from a hymnal and the heel of a child's sock. She worked from the side, never directly beneath the opening. Every 15 minutes, she stopped to remove debris. By noon, 6 coal scuttles stood full outside the door. The blockage continued upward. Abigail assembled 2 fiberglass rods and attached the wire brush. She pushed it into the flue until resistance stopped her at approximately 7 feet. Turning clockwise, as Walter's diagram instructed, she advanced the brush a few inches at a time. Turning backward could unscrew the brush and leave it inside the chimney. The first downward pull released a sheet of creosote. It struck the damp cloth with a brittle sound like thin glass. Abigail examined it in daylight. The deposit was glossy, black, and curled along one edge. The manual identified it as Stage 3 glazed creosote, capable of igniting at temperatures lower than a clean flue would ordinarily tolerate. She carried a piece to Walter that afternoon. He held it near the stove but did not touch it to flame. You cannot brush glaze out. What removes it? Mechanical scraping, or a chimney sweep with chains. How much? More than you have. I have an account. Not for foolish debt. Walter lent her a triangular flue scraper attached to a flexible shaft and showed her how to feel the difference between tile, mortar, and hardened deposit. Tile rings, mortar drags, creosote skips. He tapped each material with the scraper so she could hear. Abigail returned before dark. The work required 9 hours spread across 2 days. She advanced the scraper upward by measured sections, loosening the glaze without striking the clay liner hard enough to crack it. Every few feet she withdrew the tool, assembled another rod, and returned to the obstruction. Her shoulders burned from keeping both arms raised. Soot found the edges of the goggles and settled into the creases beside her nose. At 13 feet, the scraper encountered a change in angle. The flue bent around an upstairs fireplace before rising toward the roof. Nesting material had packed the offset tightly. Abigail used the brush first, then the scraper, then a hook fashioned from stiff wire. Twigs descended one at a time. The final obstruction was a dead squirrel preserved by dryness. She wrapped it in newspaper and buried it beside the birds. On the third morning, the brush reached the chimney cap. Light appeared in the inspection mirror as a narrow silver line. Abigail went outside and looked up. A section of wire mesh had collapsed across the opening, but smoke could pass through one side. She marked the cap repair on her growing list and returned to the library. Cleaning the smoke chamber required a different method. Its sloped walls had collected soot nearly an inch thick behind the lintel. Abigail scraped from the top downward, using the mirror to inspect corners. She found 2 missing mortar joints and 1 brick loosened enough to move under finger pressure. The manual warned that heat could enter surrounding wood through such gaps. She did not light the fire. Walter sold her a small bag of refractory mortar for $1.08, a pointing trowel for 75 cents, and a stiff masonry brush for 32 cents. He added each amount to the ledger. Abigail dampened the joints with a spray bottle, pressed mortar fully into the voids, and tooled the surface concave. The loose brick was removed, cleaned, reset, and braced overnight with a short board wedged against the firebox floor. The refractory material required 24 hours before low heat and 72 before full heat. She wrote the times on the wall in chalk. During the wait, Abigail inspected the cast-iron stove in the back room. Its firebox held less debris, but the disconnected stovepipe had rusted through at one elbow. She decided the fireplace was the safer first source of heat. She collected fallen limbs from beneath the walnut trees and rejected every piece that felt heavy with moisture. Dry branches sounded sharp when struck together. Wet wood answered dully. Walter allowed her to take a bundle of seasoned oak scraps from behind the hardware store. Kindling only. I know. You do not know yet. He included 3 lengths of split hickory. On the 4th evening, Abigail built the first fire. She opened the damper completely and warmed the flue with a candle held beneath the throat. Cold air initially pushed the flame downward. After 6 minutes, the draft reversed and drew the flame upright. She arranged 2 dry sticks parallel on the grate, crossed them with smaller pieces, and placed twisted newspaper beneath. The first match broke. The second remained lit. Fire climbed the paper, then reached the kindling. Abigail watched the smoke carefully. A small amount entered the room, hesitated beneath the mantel, and was pulled upward. She added no larger wood for 10 minutes. The mortar joints remained dark and stable. No smoke appeared along the chimney breast or in the room above. She climbed the stairs, checked the wall with the back of her hand, and returned. Only then did she add 1 piece of hickory. Heat moved into the library gradually, first as scent, then as pressure against her face. Dampness lifted from the stone hearth. The nearest walnut paneling changed from gray-brown to a warmer color as firelight crossed its grain. Abigail sat on the floor without removing her coat. She had been warm in shelters, stores, buses, offices, and cars. Those rooms belonged to schedules. Doors opened at certain hours. Lights were extinguished by someone else. Heat arrived through systems she could neither see nor control. This fire had required 3 days of soot, mortar, reading, scraping, waiting, and refusal to guess. It was modest, It held. She placed Walter's enamel pot near the coals and cooked oatmeal with dried apple pieces cut from fruit Mrs. Bell had sent in one of the water jugs. The meal thickened slowly. She added a pinch of salt and ate from the pot with the blackened teaspoon found beneath the library dust. Steam warmed her face. Outside, the temperature fell below 20. Inside, the fire consumed one careful piece of wood at a time. The following morning, Abigail began an inventory of the library and adjoining workroom. She used pages torn from the blank rear section of an obsolete county tax booklet. Each object received a line, a location, a condition, and a possible use. She numbered shelves from left to right and drawers from top to bottom. Library Shelf 1 held 4 swollen novels, 1 atlas without covers, and a hymnal dated 1904. Shelf 2 contained rolled survey maps tied with cotton tape. Shelf 3 appeared empty until she ran her hand along the rear molding and found 3 brass shelf pins wrapped in paper. Shelf 4 held a broken clock, 2 candle sockets, and a glass inkwell with a chipped rim. The lower cabinets contained poker chips, a moth-eaten lap blanket, 6 curtain rings, and a box of blank calling cards bearing the Blackwood address. The adjoining room required more time. The shallow drawers labeled thread and cloth contained nothing, but the lowest cabinet held a book press. Its iron screw had seized, though the platen remained level. Beside it rested 2 sewing frames, a lying press, and a wooden finishing stove intended for heating brass bookbinding tools. Abigail cleaned each item with a dry brush. In the closet she found 3 rolls of book cloth ruined by mildew, a bundle of linen tapes still usable at the center, and a jar containing wheat paste hardened into a pale stone. A wall cabinet held 23 brass finishing tools. Some carried simple lines or dots. Others were engraved with leaves, stars, acorns, crosses, and a repeating pattern of open hands. Their wooden handles had darkened from decades of use. Abigail arranged them by width on the table. The largest bore a mark she remembered from Margaret's workroom, an oval surrounding a small walnut branch. She pressed the cold brass against her thumb. The shape left no color, only an impression that faded while she watched. Beneath the tools lay a ledger whose pages had been removed cleanly at the spine. Only the binding remained. Its marbled paper sides were blue and black, and its leather corners showed no mildew. Abigail opened the empty cover. A faint pencil line appeared along the rear paste-down. Not here. She tilted the board toward the window. The words had been written lightly, almost rubbed away. Beneath them, another line extended toward the foredge. It ended beside a pinhole, no larger than the point of an awl. Abigail examined the cabinet. Nothing moved. She removed the drawers one at a time and looked behind them. The wall was plaster over lath. No gap appeared at the sides. The cabinet back sounded solid when tapped with the wooden handle of the masonry brush. She returned the drawers. On the 5th morning, the 3 knocks came again. Abigail was in the library feeding one piece of oak into the fire. The sound arrived from behind the shelves. Knock. A pause. Knock. The same interval. Knock. She crossed the room before the final vibration had faded and placed her palm against the walnut paneling. Cold wood. No movement. She waited. The sound did not repeat. Abigail began a methodical test. She removed every object from the shelves and placed them on the dining table. Using the handle of Walter's screwdriver, she tapped along the wall at 6-inch intervals beginning near the floor. Most areas answered with the dense note of plaster and brick behind wood. At shoulder height, near the central shelves, the sound changed. Hollow. The difference extended across approximately 3 feet and rose nearly to the crown molding. Abigail marked the boundaries with chalk. The shelf unit itself appeared built into the wall, but closer inspection revealed narrow seams along both vertical sides. Dust had sealed them. 4 screw heads had been concealed beneath walnut plugs. She did not remove them immediately. First, she measured the shelving unit. 7 feet 4 inches high, 3 feet 2 inches wide, 11 inches deep. Then she measured the corresponding exterior wall from the window opening to the room corner. The interior dimensions accounted for less space than the exterior wall contained. 28 inches were missing. The manual contained no chapter for hidden rooms, but Margaret's habits supplied a procedure. Do not force what may have been designed to move. Abigail cleaned the seams with a soft brush. She examined the floor for scrape marks. Near the baseboard, a shallow arc crossed the boards, nearly invisible beneath grime. The shelves had once swung outward. She searched for a latch. Each brass shelf pin was removed and tested. The inkwell recess was inspected. She pressed carved molding, lifted the lower trim, and ran her fingertips beneath every ledge. Nothing released. She returned to the empty ledger cover. Not here. The pinhole beside the pencil line could accept an awl. Abigail inserted the narrowest finishing tool handle instead. It reached no mechanism. She tried a straightened length of wire and felt resistance 1 inch inside the board. A spring moved. Somewhere behind the shelves, metal clicked. The 3 knocks had not been knocks. They had been the settling of a hidden latch responding to temperature. Abigail pulled gently on the central shelf. It did not move. She removed the brass-edged inkwell from shelf 4 and discovered a circular depression beneath it. At the center lay a disc of cedar, flush with the wood and darkened by dust. She pressed it. The disc descended 1/2 inch. The shelving unit released with a quiet exhalation of wood against wood. Abigail stepped back. The full section moved outward on concealed iron pivots, its lower edge following the arc worn into the floor. Behind it stood a narrow opening framed in brick. Air emerged carrying cedar, paper, and cold earth. A staircase descended. The upper 3 steps were walnut. Below them the construction changed to stone. The passage was too narrow for 2 people to walk side by side. Its ceiling sloped beneath the main staircase, then disappeared into darkness. Abigail took the flashlight from the mantel. She did not descend. Not yet. She returned to Walter's farm and asked whether he could come to the manor. He studied her face. What fell? Nothing. What burned? Nothing. What did you open? She placed the cedar disc on his counter. It had loosened from its recess when the shelf moved. Walter removed his glasses. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he closed the hardware store 1 hour early. They walked the drive together carrying 2 lanterns, a crowbar, rope, and Walter's leather tool bag. Belle followed without invitation. At the library entrance the dog stopped. Her ears flattened. She sniffed the air from behind the pivoted shelves, but would not approach the stair. Walter raised 1 lantern. My father knew there was a passage. Did Margaret? She knew everything in that house that mattered. Why did she hide it? Walter looked at the dust-free arc where the shelves had moved. She may not have been the one who hid it. He tied one end of the rope around the book press and the other around his waist. Abigail protested until he handed her the lantern. You are lighter. That is not an answer. It is the answer I have. Walter descended first. His steps numbered 17. At the bottom, the passage opened into a brick chamber beneath the central hall. Thousands of envelopes covered the walls in floor-to-ceiling pigeonholes, bundled by year and tied with linen tape. Abigail raised the lantern. Every visible envelope bore her name. My dear Abby. Dates began in the year of her birth. 1 letter for every month at first, then 2 each year, then 1 each birthday and Christmas. The latest had been sealed only months before Margaret's death. Walter removed his hat. On the opposite wall, shelves held wrapped packages labeled by age. For her first birthday, for 5, for 10, for when she is old enough to choose her own coat, for when she believes no one remembered. Abigail set the lantern on a table. Her hands remained at her sides. Walter did not touch her. In the center of the chamber stood a long cedar chest secured by two simple clasps. Its lid bore the open-hand finishing pattern Abigail had found among the brass tools. A smaller tin box rested on top. Beside it lay a journal bound in dark green leather. Richard Hale's name appeared on the first page visible beneath its strap. Abigail looked away from it. Not because she did not want the truth, because truth arranged carelessly could become another kind of theft. "We open one thing at a time," she said. Walter nodded. They began with the cedar chest. The clasps lifted without resistance. Inside, objects had been wrapped in linen, waxed paper, and cotton batting. Each package carried Margaret's handwriting and a number corresponding to an inventory sheet fixed beneath the lid. The first contained the brass-edged ruler Richard had taken from Abigail's closet. The initials MW8 remained near its lower edge. Abigail held it level against the lantern light. The second package contained Margaret's blue needle cloth, complete with bone-handled awls, curved needles, lifting knives, and thread cutters. The third held a backing hammer with a polished face and a handle worn narrow by use. The fourth contained 3 generations of finishing tools, each wrapped separately and labeled with an owner's name and working dates. Eleanor Brooks, 1881 to 1936. Margaret Brooks Whitaker, 1919 to 1968. Margaret Whitaker Hale, 1952 to 2011. The fifth package held prepared goatskin in russet, black, green, and deep blue. The material had been sealed with cedar shavings and remained supple. The sixth held linen thread. The seventh contained hand-marbled papers and patterns Abigail had seen only in museum books: Spanish wave, nonpareil, stone, shell, and peacock. The eighth contained a child's book press, compact enough to operate from a table. Its screw turned smoothly. A note had been tied to the handle. "For small hands until they become sure." Abigail read the line once and placed the note back. The wrapped birthday gifts were opened in order. At age 1, a cloth rabbit with brown ears. At age 2, a wooden pull toy shaped like a horse. At age 3, red mittens. At age 4, a picture book repaired along the spine before it had ever been read. At age 5, a blue enamel cup matching the one Abigail had used during weekends in Margaret's workroom. At age 6, blunt scissors and folded paper. At age 7, a child-sized apron. At age 8, a flower press. At age 9, a magnifying glass. At age 10, her first bone folder, carved with the letter A. The later gifts became less childlike and more deliberate: a fountain pen, a wool coat carefully wrapped against moths, a set of carpenter's pencils, a field guide to walnut trees, a pair of silver earrings made from bookbinders' corners, a blank journal bound in calfskin, a bus map of West Virginia with routes marked in red ink. For her 18th birthday, Margaret had prepared a complete set of binding tools inside an oak case. For 19, there was no object, only an envelope. Abigail placed it beside the unopened letters. They worked for 3 hours without opening the green journal. The tin box came last. Its lid had been sealed with wax along the rim. Walter warmed a thin knife above the lantern and cut the seal without damaging the metal. Inside lay currency, coins, a medal, and 3 folded documents. Abigail removed the money onto the cedar table and counted it twice. The paper currency totaled $4,863. Most bills were 10s and 20s from different decades. Several older notes carried designs no longer in circulation. One silver certificate dated 1935 bore a blue seal. A $5 bill had been folded around a lock of gray hair tied with thread. The cash and coins totaled $5,941.17. Useful, but nowhere near enough to save Blackwood. The real value lay beneath them: a property tax reserve statement, 31 years of repair fund records, and a notarized declaration from Margaret. The withdrawals showed that money intended to preserve Blackwood had been diverted after her death. The room had not been built to make Abigail rich. It had been built to prove who had tried to erase her, and to give her a chance to take the house back. The final line was underlined: "Do not turn survival into display." Abigail returned the money to the tin box in the same order. She spent none of it. The green journal remained on the table. Walter looked toward it twice but did not suggest opening it. The cover had been fastened with a leather strap. Richard's name on the exposed page appeared beneath a heading written in Margaret's hand: "Record of Interference." Beside the journal lay a thick envelope addressed simply, "To Abigail, when the house has found her." The paper had been sealed with dark red wax stamped with an open hand. Abigail lifted it. The envelope was heavier than an ordinary letter. Several folded pages shifted within. Margaret's handwriting crossed the front with the same leftward final stroke Abigail remembered from the deed. Her thumb rested beneath the seal. Then she placed the letter back on the table. "Not tonight," she said. Walter replaced his hat. "No." They carried the heirloom tools upstairs first, then the birthday gifts, the tin box, the journal, and the sealed envelope. Each trip required 17 steps. Abigail counted them without intending to. The cash was stored inside the workroom cabinet. Walter fitted a temporary hasp to the door and gave Abigail both keys. The letters remained below. There were too many to move before dawn, and the chamber was dry. Abigail closed the pivoting shelves, leaving the cedar disc mechanism unlatched so she could reopen it easily. Walter departed after midnight. At the gate, Belle waited beneath the upright pillar. She had not followed them into the house. When Walter called, she rose and walked beside him without looking back. Abigail did not sleep. She placed the sealed envelope on the library table and sat across from it while the fire settled into coals. The green journal remained locked inside the cabinet. The tin box rested beneath the book press. She could have broken the wax. No one would have stopped her. Instead, she carried the envelope outside. The sky had cleared. Frost silvered the drive and the collapsed gate. Walnut branches reached across the stars without leaves. Beyond the lower field, water moved through the creek, hidden by darkness but audible where it crossed stone. Abigail followed the sound. The creek ran along the western edge of the property, narrow and black beneath the moon. Ice had formed along both banks, leaving the center open. Water passed beneath the thin shelves of ice and emerged again, carrying reflected stars and broken lines. She sat on a flat stone and placed the letter beside her. Her coat did not hold enough warmth for stillness, but she remained. All her life, answers had been delivered by people who had already arranged them. Caseworkers brought summaries. Foster parents offered conclusions. Richard carried documents inside closed portfolios. Elaine answered absence with lowered curtains and burned pages. The letter beside Abigail had waited without forcing itself open. So had the room. So had thousands of words written to a child who had never been allowed to receive them. She watched the water until the eastern sky became faintly gray. The house was patient, so was she. Morning entered the library through the narrow spaces between the shutters and laid 4 pale bars across the floor. Abigail had returned from the creek before sunrise, though she had not undressed or slept. The sealed envelope remained on the table where she had placed it, beside the extinguished lantern and the ruler recovered from the cedar chest. She heated water in the enamel pot, washed her hands, and dried them on a linen cloth. Only then did she sit. The handwriting on the envelope had changed since the weekends in the workroom. The letters were narrower. Some strokes weakened near their ends, as though the pen had paused to gather strength. Yet the habits remained: the open curve of the capital A, the careful spacing between words, and the final crossbar drawn leftward. Abigail placed the brass ruler beside the seal. Margaret had taught her to open valuable paper without tearing the fibers. Steam was too dangerous. A knife could slip beneath the flap, but only if its edge was blunt and the hand patient. Abigail selected the bone folder carved with her initial. She worked it along the upper seam a fraction at a time. The wax seal remained unbroken. The paper released with a dry sigh. Inside were 12 pages folded in thirds. A sprig of rosemary had been pressed between the first and second sheets. It had lost its color, but not all of its scent. Abigail unfolded the letter. The first line stood alone. "My dear one, whoever you are. If this letter has reached you, then the house has done what I could not. It has remained in one place long enough for you to find it." I began writing these pages in Winchester, Virginia, on the 23rd day of February, 2009, after Dr. Miriam Feld told me that the weakness in my hands was caused by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She spoke plainly. I was grateful for that. The disease would take strength first, then movement, and, perhaps, speech. It would not, she said, take memory in the same manner. I came home and sharpened 3 pencils. There are truths that should not depend upon a failing hand, so I am setting them down while I may still form each letter as I intend. You belong to a family of binders, repairers, stationers, and keepers of records. That statement is not meant to burden you with a trade. It is meant to return to you the knowledge that your life did not begin in an office file. The first of our line in this county was Eliza Brooks, born near Kendal in Westmoreland, England in 1817. She arrived in Baltimore in 1841 with a wooden press, 2 knives, and a daughter named Ruth. Eliza repaired hymnals for churches along the Potomac and ledgers for merchants who did not always permit her name to appear on the account. Ruth Brooks, born in 1838, moved with her mother to Jefferson County in 1847. She married Elias Whitaker, a cooper, and continued binding books from the east room of this house. Her daughter, Miriam Whitaker, born in 1862, learned marbling from a German printer in Frederick and introduced the walnut branch mark you will find on our tools. Miriam's daughter was Eleanor Brooks Whitaker, born in 1881. She returned to the Brooks surname after her husband died and taught 3 daughters the trade. The eldest, Margaret Brooks Whitaker, was born in 1919. She was my mother. I was named for her when I was born in 1952. Your mother was my only child. Her name was Elaine Margaret Hale, though she seldom used the middle name after she left home. She was born in 1973 in Martinsburg. She could sew a headband more cleanly than I could at her age, and she sang while sanding leather edges. She also carried a fear I did not understand soon enough. On October 11, 1978, a fire began in the drying cabinet of our Charlestown shop. Linseed oil cloths had been left folded in a covered bin. Heat gathered during the night until the cloth ignited. No one died, but the shop, the front office, and nearly 2 centuries of customer records were lost. My mother closed the trade after that day. She believed our work had invited ruin because so much of other people's history had been placed in our care. For 31 years, no sign bearing our name was hung in public. We repaired only what was brought privately to the house. We accepted cash, eggs, timber, flour, and labor. We kept no advertisement. Silence, once practiced, becomes skilled. Our family lost more than a shop. My grandfather, Samuel Brooks, died in France on October 8, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. His Purple Heart is in the tin box. My mother's husband, Daniel Whitaker, served in Korea and never returned from a patrol near the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950. His body was not recovered. My brother, Peter Hale, was killed in Vietnam near Hue in February 1968. The house learned waiting from the women who remained. I need to tell you now why you did not know any of this. Your Uncle Richard believed Blackwood should pass to him. He also believed inheritance was easiest to control when those with a stronger claim could not be found. After Elaine became ill, he offered help. His help consisted of forms, addresses, signatures, and advice given to people already exhausted. He persuaded her that I intended to take you from her. He told me she had left the state. He returned letters unopened. He filed corrections that changed names, dates, and placement numbers. He used my age and illness as evidence that I could not provide care. When I learned enough to act, you had already been moved. I do not write this so that you will pursue him. Hatred is an expensive tenant. It occupies every room and repairs nothing. The Green Journal contains the dates, copies, affidavits, and names of those who witnessed his interference. Give it to Thomas if you need the records protected. Beyond that, choose silence if silence gives you peace. A true account does not require vengeance to remain true. There are practical matters. The west workroom is dry because the outer wall was repointed in 1996 with 1 part natural hydraulic lime to 2 and 1/2 parts washed sharp sand. Do not patch old brick with Portland cement. It is stronger than the brick and will cause the faces to break away during freezing. For wheat paste, use 1 measure wheat starch to 4 measures cold water. Whisk before heating. Bring it slowly to approximately 180 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there until translucent, usually 8 to 10 minutes. Strain while warm, thin with clean water after cooling. Do not keep it more than 3 days. When preparing leather for a spine, pare the turn-ins first. Keep the blade nearly flat. If the edge appears white, you have cut too deeply. For marbling, begin with carrageenan size mixed at 1 ounce to 1 gallon of water. Allow it to rest overnight. Alum the paper lightly and let it dry completely. Ox gall should be added by drops, never poured. Test color on waste paper. Humidity changes everything. Linen thread should be no thicker than the folded section requires. Too much strength in the thread will cut weak paper. Beeswax reduces abrasion, but excess wax gathers dirt. Keep paste away from the hinge line until the text block is square. Keep your hands clean. Keep your promises cleaner. The money in the tin box was saved across many years. Use it for shelter, tools, medicine, or food. Do not mistake preservation for poverty. Do not mistake possession for worth. Inheritance is not the receiving of objects. Objects can be stolen, sold, burned, hidden, or lost beneath a careless hand. Inheritance is the moment when another person's kept attention becomes useful in your life. A repaired book carries both the first maker and the later hand that refused to let it disappear. Neither hand owns the whole story. Both are necessary. Perhaps you will bind books. Perhaps you will not. You may plant the land, sell it, close the rooms, or leave this place after 1 night. A gift becomes a chain when the dead demand obedience from the living. I ask only that you know you were wanted. I wrote on your first birthday. I bought the blue cup when you turned 5. I made the coat during the winter you were 12 and did not know where to send it. Every Christmas I place something in the lower room because hope requires a physical practice. I searched until my hands no longer obeyed me. Thomas continued after I could not. If Elaine failed you, remember that fear can make a person surrender what she loves before anyone has taken it. This does not excuse the surrender. It may explain the shape of the wound. You are allowed to grieve without forgiving quickly. You are allowed to forgive without returning. You are allowed to build a family from those who remain when no obligation binds them. Behind the kitchen, the oldest walnut tree carries an iron horseshoe in its western side. My mother placed it there after the 1936 flood. Beneath that tree, Samuel carved his initials before leaving for France. There is more history in the ground and timber than I have managed to record. Some things will wait for another season. When the rooms seem too large, open only one. When the work seems endless, finish one honest task before dark. When loneliness tells you that you have been forgotten, remember that absence is not proof. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Whittaker, Hail Blackwood Manor. February 23, 2009. Abigail reached the final line without moving her feet. The fire had burned low. Morning had brightened behind the shutters, turning the cracks between them white. A small drift of ash collapsed inward on the grate. She read the letter again. The second reading took longer. She paused at each name and copied the dates onto a blank inventory page. Eliza, Ruth, Miriam, Eleanor, Margaret, Elaine, Abigail. 6 women connected by more than the documents Richard had altered. When she finished, she aligned the sheets against the table edge. The pages had been folded twice before, and the original creases remained visible. Abigail did not add new ones. She bent each sheet along the remembered lines and returned the rosemary sprig to its place. The envelope would not close without breaking the seal. She wrapped it in clean linen instead. Walter arrived near noon carrying 2 water jugs and a sack of split oak. He saw the letter on the table and stopped before entering the room. Abigail handed him the page containing Samuel's name. Walter read it standing beside the fireplace. "My father said the metal came by train," he said. "Margaret's mother would not open the case for 11 years. Abigail touched the green journal where it remained locked in the cabinet. "She did not want me to pursue Richard." "That sounds like her. She kept proof." "That also sounds like her." Walter placed the page back on the table. "What will you do?" "Give the journal to Thomas." "And after?" Abigail folded the linen over the letter. "Repair the roof." Walter nodded once. The answer was sufficient. After he left, Abigail went through the kitchen and opened the back door. It had swollen at the lower hinge, requiring both hands to pull it inward. Beyond the threshold, the ground sloped toward an abandoned vegetable garden enclosed by a low stone wall. Dead asparagus stalks leaned against the frost. A rusted pump stood beside a collapsed cold frame. The oldest walnut tree grew farther west. It was not the tallest. Lightning had removed its upper crown years before, leaving 2 main limbs extending in opposite directions. The trunk measured more than 15 feet around and bore deep ridges in the bark. Moss covered its northern side. Abigail walked around it slowly. On the western face, 5 feet above the ground, iron emerged from the living wood. The horseshoe had been nearly swallowed by the trunk. Only its curved outer edge and 2 square nail heads remained visible. Bark had grown around it in thick folds, holding the metal as carefully as tissue closing around an old wound. Below the horseshoe, Abigail found carved letters. S.B. 1917. Time had widened the cuts. Lichen filled the lower half of the date. She placed her fingertips inside the initials. Samuel had stood there before France, perhaps with a pocket knife in one hand and someone calling him from the house. He could not have known that a great-great-grandniece would find the mark more than a century later. He had only made it because the tree was present and his hand was young. Near the roots, one stone differed from the others. It had been set upright rather than lying flat, its surface dressed smooth on one side. Abigail cleared leaves from the base but did not move it. No instruction in the letter asked her to dig. Some things would wait. She returned to the library at dusk and opened the package labeled "For 5." The blue enamel cup was smaller than she remembered. Its rim had been repaired with a thin line of solder. Margaret had wrapped it in cotton and placed a candle inside. The candle was beeswax, hand-poured, and nearly 7 inches long. A paper band around its base carried a date from 1950. From Mother's workroom. Save for a return. Abigail set the candle in a brass holder from the library shelf. The wick had stiffened. She warmed it between her fingers, trimmed the blackened tip with Margaret's scissors, and held a match to it. The flame struggled at first. A bead of wax formed, slipped down one side, and stopped near the cup's rim. The scent was faintly sweet, unlike the paraffin candles from the hardware store. For 60 years, the candle had waited inside drawers, cupboards, and hidden rooms. Someone had saved it through war telegrams, floods, illness, and the closing of a trade. Margaret had placed it inside a child's cup for a return she could not be certain would occur. Now its light touched the walnut shelves. Abigail placed the letter beside it. The flame illuminated the evidence of small hands that had carried her farther than any single rescue could have done. Denise, who had delayed the office closing long enough to explain health coverage twice. The unnamed woman in the Martinsburg laundromat, who had pressed quarters into Abigail's palm and looked away before gratitude could become a performance. Doris, who had wrapped 2 biscuits and claimed they were counted wrong. The farmer who had slowed his truck and pointed toward a hay barn. Mrs. Miller, who had brought coffee without asking for a history. Mrs. Voss, who had opened the county door after hours. Walter, who recorded every item so help would not feel like charity disguised as ownership. Thomas, who had eaten half a cold sandwich beneath an awning and told the truth in public places. None had changed Abigail's life in a single dramatic act. They had each moved one obstacle. A wet night became a dry one. An empty morning acquired bread. A locked office opened. A dangerous chimney became work rather than disaster. The chain had held because no person had been asked to carry all of it. Abigail turned toward the room as though someone might be seated beyond the candlelight. There are kindnesses too modest to appear important when they are given. A ride to the edge of town. A meal wrapped without comment. A name remembered after everyone else has forgotten it. A door held open 5 minutes beyond closing. Perhaps someone once did such a thing for you. Perhaps the person never learned what followed. You may still remember the weather that day, the sound of their voice, or the exact object they placed in your hand. If you carry one small kindness from your own life, tell us about it. Not to praise the giver beyond what is true, but to let the rest of us see how far a careful act can travel. Abigail lowered her eyes to the candle. Wax had begun to gather in the blue cup. She did not open the green journal that night. Thomas would read it first and decide which records required protection. Margaret had kept the evidence long enough. Abigail would not turn pain into an evening's appetite. Instead, she carried the heirloom tools into the back room. The oak case fit beneath the cot, but she did not place it there. She set it on the floor beside her pillow. The brass ruler lay across the lid. The needlecloth rested on top, folded along its faded blue seams. The purple heart remained inside its case beside the tools. Abigail wrapped Margaret's letter in the wool coat prepared for her 12th winter and placed it beneath the oak case, away from the damp wall. Before extinguishing the beeswax candle, she checked the fireplace, the door latch, and the weather line beneath the eastern roof. The house settled around her. A board contracted in the hall. Wind moved lightly across the chimney cap. Far below, behind the walnut shelves, thousands of unopened letters remained arranged by year. Abigail lay on the cot with one hand resting on the tool case. For the first time, sleep came before she had finished listening for departure. The first snow arrived on December 3rd. It began before dawn as a dry whisper against the shutters and continued until 6½ inches lay across the drive, the fallen gate, and the lower branches of the walnut trees. By noon, the eastern roof opening had gathered a white rim around its broken edges. Meltwater would follow as soon as the temperature rose. Abigail read the roofing chapter 3 times. The first reading gave her the sequence. The second gave her the language. The third exposed everything she had failed to understand. Rafter tails, roof pitch, sheathing, drip edge, underlayment, headlap, exposure, valleys, flashing. She copied each unfamiliar term into the inventory booklet and drew the diagrams again by hand. The eastern slope measured 28 feet from ridge to eave and 36 feet along the wall. The collapsed section occupied nearly 11 feet of width, though several surrounding rafters showed water staining and could not be trusted without inspection. Walter lent her a 24-foot extension ladder and a framing square. She waited for the snow to harden before climbing. The roof pitch was steeper than it had appeared from the ground. Abigail tied the ladder to the portico column and looped a second rope around the chimney base, testing both knots twice. From the eave she could see where slate had slipped, where nails had rusted through, and where two rafters had cracked beside the eastern dormer. She returned to the ground before calculating materials. The damaged area required 12 replacement rafters if she sistered the weakened members rather than removing them entirely. She would need 3/4-inch pine sheathing over the open section, 30-pound roofing felt, copper flashing for the wall junction, and enough temporary asphalt shingles to survive the inspection period until the remaining slate could be repaired properly. Walter objected to asphalt. "So do I," Abigail said. "Then why buy it? Because slate repair costs more than the house can carry this winter." Walter considered that. Temporary is honest if you name it temporary. They calculated together at the hardware counter. 14 bundles of 3-tab shingles at 26 square feet of coverage each after waste. 3 rolls of 30-pound felt. 8 sheets of exterior plywood, 4 by 8 feet. 36 linear feet of galvanized drip edge. 16 pieces of 2 by 8 southern yellow pine, each 12 feet long. 10 pounds of 8-penny ring shank nails. 5 pounds of 1 1/4-inch roofing nails. 2 tubes of asphalt roof cement for emergency seams only. The materials cost $289.42. Abigail removed 3 silver dollars from the tin box. Walter would not accept them. Spend modern money first. There is no modern money. Then use paper. She brought the smallest bills from the reserve and recorded the amount in Margaret's accounting ledger. Every purchase received a date, purpose, and expected life. The lumberyard delivered the materials to the foot of the drive. The driver would not attempt the moss-covered lane, so Abigail carried the smaller pieces uphill and dragged the lumber 2 boards at a time using a rope sling. On the second afternoon, Walter opened a locked cabinet behind the hardware counter. Inside lay a roofing hatchet with a square pole, a narrow blade, and a leather-wrapped handle. This was Margaret's father's. Abigail took it carefully. The steel carried dark marks from long use. One side of the head contained a nail slot. The handle had been shaped for a right hand and worn smooth at the base of the thumb. Did he build roofs? During the Depression, everybody built whatever kept weather outside. Walter placed the tool on the counter. He set the south wing slate after the hurricane of '33. Abigail added the hatchet to the inventory but left the ownership line blank. Walter corrected it. Abigail Brooks. She did not erase his writing. The skilled help arrived the following morning without invitation. His name was Amos Reddick. He was 72, lean as a fence rail with a gray mustache and a permanent bend in his left index finger. He had roofed barns, churches, and schoolhouses for 41 years before a fall from a grain elevator persuaded his knees to retire. Walter had told him about Blackwood. Amos parked an olive green truck beside the fallen pillar and examined the roof from 4 positions without speaking. He used binoculars from the lower field, then walked the perimeter, kicking snow away from the foundation where roof runoff had carved channels in the soil. Finally, he looked at Abigail. "You climbed it?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "Do not." "I need to work." Then, work attached. He opened his truck and removed 2 safety harnesses, roof jacks, planks, chalk line, pry bars, a slate ripper, and a dented metal lunchbox. "What do you charge?" "Nothing." "I have funds. I do not want them." "Then why are you here?" Amos looked toward the damaged roof. "Your grandmother repaired my wife's Bible after our boy spilled lamp oil through Psalms." He lifted one harness, put this on. The work took 11 days. Day 1 was inspection and removal. They lifted broken slate from the damaged area and stacked salvageable pieces on padded boards. Amos showed Abigail how to slide the slate ripper beneath a tile, hook the nail, and strike downward without cracking neighboring courses. He spoke rarely. When she tried to pry too close to an edge, he said, "Hands lower." When she stepped above a roof jack, he said, "Stay beneath steel." When she rushed a nail, he said, "That nail's proud." Abigail looked at the head standing above the sheathing. "Pull it." She did. Days 2 and 3 exposed the framing. The open roof had admitted enough water to soften 3 rafters near their upper ends. 2 others carried long splits but remained sound beneath the damaged portion. Amos taught Abigail to sister each rafter with a new 2x8 extending at least 6 feet beyond the weak section. They lifted the new member beside the old one, clamped both together, checked alignment with a string line, and fastened them using staggered half-inch carriage bolts with washers rather than relying on nails alone. "Wood moves," Amos said. "Bolts allow that. Bolts hold while it does." At the dormer corner, one rafter had twisted out of plane. Abigail measured the difference, 3/4 of an inch. Amos showed her how to cut a temporary brace, draw the member slowly into alignment, and leave it overnight before fastening. Forcing it in one movement could split the aged wood. On day 4, they replaced sheathing. Each plywood panel was laid perpendicular to the rafters with 1/8-inch gaps for expansion. Abigail staggered the joints and drove ring shank nails every 6 inches along panel edges, every 12 inches across interior supports. Amos listened to her hammering. 3 strokes. The first set the nail. The second drove it. The third seated the head flush. More strokes bruised the wood. Fewer risked bending the shank. By afternoon, Abigail's right forearm shook whenever she lowered the hammer. She switched hands for carrying, but not fastening. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Day 5 brought wind from the northwest and temperatures below freezing. They remained on the ground, cutting copper flashing beneath the portico and sharpening tools. Amos showed her how to dress a bent hatchet edge with a mill file, moving in one direction and preserving the bevel. The old roofing hatchet took a clean edge. Day 6 began with the chalk line. They snapped horizontal guides across the sheathing according to the shingle exposure, checking every 4th line against the eave rather than trusting accumulated measurements. Amos coated the line lightly. Too much chalk produced a wide mark and allowed careless placement. Thin line. Exact work. The felt went down from the eave upward, each course overlapping the lower by 4 inches. At the temporary valley, they doubled the underlayment and extended it beyond both sides of the damaged area. Abigail used the roofing hatchet for the first shingle course. The tool felt balanced differently from Walter's ordinary hammer. The shorter handle kept her wrist close to the work. The nail slot caught crooked fasteners without damaging the shingle surface. The remaining days followed a measured rhythm. Climb before full light, check rope, check knots, raise materials, snap line, fasten, inspect, descend before frost returned to the roof. Doris from the Hagerstown diner appeared on day 8 carrying a paper bag of sandwiches and a jar of coffee. She had learned Abigail's location from Walter, though she gave no explanation for driving so far. "You still counting these wrong?" Abigail asked. Doris placed the bag on the porch. Every week, she left before anyone could thank her at length. On day 10, they installed the final temporary shingles around the dormer and counterflashed the brick wall. Amos cut each copper piece so its upper edge entered a mortar joint rather than lying against the surface. Abigail raked the joints by hand, inserted the metal, and repointed them with lime mortar. On the 11th day, December 15th, they tested the repair with water. Walter carried buckets to the attic while Amos poured slowly from the ridge. Abigail remained beneath the new sheathing with a lantern, checking nail points, joints, and the dormer corner. No drop appeared. They changed positions and repeated the test. still dry. Amos gathered his tools. Abigail offered payment once more. He closed the truck tailgate. Keep the hatchet sharp. Is that the price? It is the work. He drove away before sunset. That night, rain replaced snow. Water crossed the new shingles, entered the copper channel, and fell cleanly beyond the foundation. The room beneath remained dry. The north chimney worsened during the first week of January. Freezing rain entered the cracked crown and expanded inside the brick. Each thaw left red fragments on the ground. Some faces had spalled entirely, exposing pale interiors that crumbled under a fingernail. Mortar near the upper courses had become powder. Abigail closed every fireplace connected to the stack and tied warning cloth across the upstairs hearths. The library chimney remained usable, but the county inspection required all unstable masonry above the roofline to be secured. Loose bricks could fall through the slate or strike anyone below. Amos returned only long enough to examine the stack through binoculars. Top 8 courses come down, all of them, until mortar answers solid. He tapped the house wall with his knuckle. Rebuild from there. The work required a roof platform. Abigail installed 2 additional roof jacks beside the chimney and laid a 10-inch scaffold plank across them. She tied a rope around the stack only below the damaged portion and wore the harness Amos had left in Walter's care. The first brick lifted with bare hands. The second broke into 3 pieces. By the time she reached sound mortar, she had removed 68 bricks. 39 could be cleaned and reused. Walter found matching handmade replacements in the collapsed carriage barn, where they had been stacked beneath a fallen beam and protected from direct rain. Old brick demanded soft mortar. Abigail followed Margaret's instruction and Walter's mason's handbook. For the exterior courses, she used 1 part natural hydraulic lime, grade 3.5, to 2 1/2 parts washed sharp sand by volume. Near the flue, she blended 1 part hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay, and 3 parts grated sand. She dry mixed the powders before adding water. The correct mortar held together when squeezed, but did not release moisture between the fingers. Too wet, and it would shrink. Too dry, and it would fail to bond with the brick. Each salvaged brick was cleaned with a wooden scraper and stiff fiber brush. Metal tools could scar the fired face. Before laying, she dampened the brick lightly so it would not pull water from the mortar too quickly. January temperatures remained in the 20s. Mortar would not cure properly below 40 degrees without protection, so Walter supplied burlap, straw, and 2 old moving blankets. Abigail built a temporary enclosure around the chimney platform using canvas stretched over narrow battens. At night, she placed a safely vented kerosene heater inside the attic beneath the work area, never on the roof itself. A thermometer hung within the enclosure. She checked it every 2 hours. For 3 weeks, the routine governed her days. Mix only what could be laid within 45 minutes. Butter the bed joint. Press the brick into place. Tap level with the wooden handle of the trowel. Fill the head joint completely. Check plumb in 2 directions. Tool the joint when it held a thumbprint without smearing. Cover before dusk. Her gloves became too stiff with mortar to feel the brick edges, so she removed them for alignment work. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. She climbed down, held them near the library fire without touching the skin to direct heat, and waited until sensation returned as a deep ache along the knuckles. Then she climbed again. Walter objected when he saw the cracks beside her fingernails. Wear gloves. I cannot feel the joints. You cannot feel anything with dead fingers. He brought thinner goatskin gloves from the store and charged them to the account for 40 cents. The rebuilt courses rose slowly. Abigail preserved the chimney's slight historic taper rather than making it perfectly vertical. She reset the clay flue tiles with expansion space around them and packed the gap using mineral wool rather than mortar, allowing the liner to move independently when heated. The crown was poured with a slope away from the flue and an overhang beyond the brick face. A flexible seal remained around the tile. On January 27th, the enclosure came down. The new masonry was darker than the lower stack, though winter and soot would soften the difference. Abigail inspected every joint from the platform before descending. The test fire began with newspaper and kindling. She kept the flame low for 30 minutes, allowing residual moisture to leave the mortar slowly. Then she added 1 piece of seasoned oak. Walter stood outside beneath the eave. Smoke rose from the chimney without leaking through the rebuilt courses. It climbed in a narrow gray column, cleared the crown, and was carried east by the wind. Abigail joined him in the snow. "Clean," he said. The smoke did not hesitate. The western rooms had white pine floors fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Dust and neglect had hidden the grain beneath a gray surface, but the boards remained thick. Only 4 planks near the side door had rotted at their ends. Abigail replaced those using pine salvaged from an upstairs closet wall, matching the width with a hand plane. The original nails were removed one at a time and reused where their shanks remained sound. Each nail had a rectangular body and a head shaped by hammering rather than machinery. Abigail drilled a narrow pilot hole before driving them into the replacement boards, preventing the dry pine from splitting. For the larger rooms, hand scraping would have required months. Walter arranged a random orbit sander rental from a flooring contractor in town. The machine cost $14 per day, plus paper. Abigail rented it for 2 days and prepared every room before the clock began. She removed quarter-round molding, set protruding nails below the surface with a punch, and covered doorways using damp cloth to contain dust. The windows opened only a few inches, so she positioned a box fan facing outward and wore the cotton mask beneath a heavier respirator Amos had left. The first pass used 80 grit paper. It removed grime, shallow stains, and the brittle remains of old finish. Abigail moved with the grain at a rate no faster than 1 foot every 3 seconds. Pausing created depressions. Tilting the machine cut circular scars. The second pass used 120 grit. The scratches softened. Pine grain emerged in long, pale bands around dark knots. The third pass used 220. This was slower and nearly silent compared with the first. Abigail sanded the edges by hand, using a block so her fingers did not hollow the softer spring growth between harder grain lines. She returned the sander before closing time on the second day. Walter inspected the rental receipt. "You used all 3 grits?" "Yes. Most people skip the last. Most people do not own the floor afterward." Walter showed Abigail how to bring the pine floor back without erasing its age. The work took 6 days. By the end, the gray boards had deepened to honey and amber, and the room held light again instead of dust. The work was repetitive, low to the ground, and hard on the wrists. By the 8th morning, she woke unable to close her right hand fully. The skin across her knuckles had split from lime, cold, and solvents. Her shoulders ached before she lifted the water jug. She entered the library, looked at the floor awaiting another rubbing, and set the cloth down. Nothing had failed. No storm was coming. No inspector stood at the gate. No person had asked her to finish before dark. Still, she could not begin. At the frozen creek, Abigail watched a heron stand motionless above the current. For the first time, she understood that patience was not the same as surrender. She rested that day. The next morning, her hand closed again, and she completed the final room before noon. 8 windows were required for the first occupancy inspection. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from frame to edge. 1 retained its original hand-blown panes from 1788, each surface wavering slightly and carrying bubbles trapped during manufacture. Abigail refused to replace that one. The frame belonged to the West Library wall and contained 12 small panes. 2 were chipped at their corners but remained secure. When sunlight passed through, the shelves appeared to bend and straighten, depending on where a person stood. Walter agreed. Old glass tells the truth imperfectly. It changes the view. So do eyes. For the missing panes, Abigail purchased salvage glass from a demolished farmhouse outside Ripon. Walter helped cut it to size using a carbide wheel, scoring each sheet once and snapping it over a wooden dowel. The sash frames were removed from their openings and laid flat across the work table. Abigail labeled every piece before disassembly. Upper sash, lower sash, left stop, right stop, interior face, exterior face. The old glazing putty had hardened like stone. She softened it with low heat from a lamp placed several inches away, never concentrating warmth long enough to crack the glass. A narrow putty knife removed the material in short sections. The metal glazing points beneath were rusted, but mostly intact. She saved those she could. Walter made her redo the first window 3 times. By sunset, her fingers were bleeding, the glass finally sat true, and Blackwood held one square of warm light where morning had shown only emptiness. Walter scraped it out, again. The second carried ridges. Again. On the third attempt, Abigail held the knife at approximately 45 degrees and drew it in one motion along the pane. The putty formed a smooth slope that shed water outward while remaining below the sightline from inside. Walter examined the corner. Keep that hand. The sash cords had failed in 6 windows. Abigail opened the weight pockets and found cast-iron counterweights suspended in the wall cavities. Some lay at the bottom where cords had snapped decades earlier. She used 1/4-inch braided cotton sash cord, chosen because synthetic line would not grip the pulleys properly and could cut into the aged wood. Each cord passed over the pulley, down the weight pocket, and through the eye of the iron counterweight. The knot was a figure 8. Compact, secure,